My name is Kendal Cockrel. I'm a software engineer at Grammarly. And like many of you, I have experience going through a lot of interviews, but also I have experience as an interviewer. And today we're just going to go over some tips on how to succeed at the technical interview for software engineers. If you're not a software engineer, I at least hope you can find some value out of some of these tips. And if you're an engineering manager, maybe you could pass this along to some people who are interested in applying to join your team. So really quickly, we're going to go over a couple of different tips, and then at the very end, if we have some time, we'll have an opportunity for questions. I do know we have a small group at 2, so we can also save that until then. So the first tip that I want to share is to make sure that you communicate with your recruiter. Typically, they're your first point of contact with the company, and you want to be open and honest with them about your timeline and expectations. What I found is that some companies can turn around an offer in a week, others might take 2 weeks, some could take a month. So if you have a start date in mind or competing offers, you want to let your recruiter know so that they can adjust the timeline to work for you. Also, make sure you clarify your time zone. I've had experiences where I was interviewing and a recruiter was in Texas while I was in San Francisco. So we thought a phone call was at 9. It was not at 9. So keep that in mind as well. Also, your recruiter is in your corner. They want you to come join the company, and they can also advocate for you when the time comes. When you're down to that offer stage and there may be something you want, your recruiter can go to bat for you. Also, they have the most insight into company culture. Recruiters are the people who bring folks in, so they have a lot of information about the culture and vibe. The next tip here is make sure that you understand what the remote interview process looks like at a particular company. I think phone screens and take-home coding challenges haven't changed much since the pre-COVID days. So usually spend an hour on the phone with an engineer solving a coding problem, or maybe you'll have a coding challenge that takes maybe an hour to complete until it's closed. Either way, when it comes to the on-site, you want to get a full breakdown of what topics are covered. That way you can better practice and prepare. You also might be able to split your interviews across multiple days, depending on availability. If you're someone like me who gets Zoom fatigue, this is really helpful because you don't have to interview for maybe like 4 hours straight. So what I've seen in my experience is a typical software engineering on-site looks like this. You may have 1 to 2 coding interviews. If you're an iOS or Android developer or a front-end developer, one of those interviews might be specific to that discipline. Then you'll also have a coding challenge where you're tasked to implement a function to solve a problem. The other technical interview is a system design interview, where you're typically given a system or a problem and you have to come up with a design to solve it. There also are 2 non-technical interviews, a values interview, also called a bar raiser, and then a manager interview, typically with the hiring manager for that role or another engineering manager within the organization. So now that you have an understanding of what to expect for an on-site, you can better practice and prepare. Let's talk about coding interviews first. If you ever were interviewing in the pre-COVID days and you had an in-person on-site, you might have actually had to write code on a whiteboard. If you liked whiteboarding, I'm sorry you're not doing that anymore. If you hated whiteboarding, congratulations. Either way, for coding interviews, you want to find out what service a company uses to conduct them. I know at Grammarly we use HackerRank. I know CoderPad is also a popular one. I've even had experiences where I've just shared my screen and written code in my local development environment. Depending on the service or how a company conducts their coding interviews, you may or may not be able to compile your code. This is important because if you rely on a debugger or other tooling, you may not have access to that during the interview. So you might want to practice solving problems without that. Also, brush up on your computer science fundamentals. That's data structures, algorithms. Most coding questions are built with a foundation of strong, on a foundation of data structures and algorithms. So if you have that strong foundation, you'll be successful. Also know that coding questions have more than one valid solution. So you typically want to go for an optimal solution and not just the correct one. If it takes you a couple minutes to think of an optimal solution and you can't think of one, try and write a correct one. A good interviewer will usually ask you follow-up questions and give you a chance to optimize. In that same vein, practice thinking out loud. The interviewer won't be able to tell if you're stuck or if you're just thinking. So if you could verbalize your thoughts, that's very helpful. And thinking about the type of things interviewers are looking for is we want to know if you take ownership of the problem and ask clarifying questions. That means, do you ask about edge cases, or do you ask if the input is normalized, or if there are any tricky gotchas that may not have been covered in the problem description? We also want to know, is your code clear and easy to read? I know it's a little hard when you're trying to iterate quickly and like write fast, but if you can keep neatness in mind, that'll really help you. We also want to know if you're comfortable writing in the language of your choice. A lot of times people will choose a language to do an interview in that they may not be strongest at, and that could kind of hurt you. You really want to choose your best language, even if it's not one that the interviewer is familiar with. We also want to know is, do you show familiarity with data structures and algorithms and use them where appropriate? If a task calls you to sort something, do you use collections.sort or do you re-implement a sort function from scratch? We also want to see if you have an understanding of runtime and space complexity. Also, if you rely on brute force approaches. If you do use a brute force approach, are you able to optimize it? So here's an example of that really quickly. So say if a coding question asks you to write a function to determine if an array contains duplicates. Both the solution on the left and right return a valid correct answer, but they have two very different runtimes. The one on the left is an n squared solution versus the one on the right, which is O of n, and uses an additional data structure. Typically, an interviewer is looking for the best solution, the most optimal one. So in this case, the one on the right would be preferred. Here's another example. So say if we want you to write a function that takes in an array of names and returns them as one comma separated string. Both of these functions do that, but the one on the left uses string concatenation and the one on the right uses a string builder. In Java, strings are immutable. So in the function on the left, we're creating a new string object every time we're combining the string together. This is fine if we've got maybe 5 names in our array, but if we have 10,000 or 100,000, the solution on the left becomes really inefficient. And the one on the right, we don't create a new string until the very end. And so when you're interviewing and writing a solution, you want to think about those hidden costs and make sure that you're optimizing for them. So switching gears a little bit, we can talk about system design interviews. So system design questions tend to be very open-ended, and your answers may vary depending on your skill level and experience. If you're a junior development or a junior developer or an entry-level engineer, we don't expect you to have a lot of experience designing large-scale systems. And let's be honest, most systems probably weren't designed by one person in the 45 minutes of an interview. Still, system design interviewers expect a conversation, and you should lead that conversation. You want to ask questions about the requirements and constraints. This can also give the interviewer a sense of where you're at and your experience level. You also want to refamiliarize yourself with existing systems and how they might have been designed. This is especially useful if you don't have a lot of system design experience. You can look online to find out, oh, how do most people design a newsfeed? How is a load balancer implemented? Those kind of things. Really, the technique to solve a system design problem is to break down the system into manageable parts and describe how they relate to one another. You also want to be sure that you weigh the trade-offs between different approaches and describe why you've made the decisions you have. Also think about ways to scale. If the system you design gets 10 times the traffic, are you going to be able to scale appropriately and handle that without too many changes? So again, you can approach these questions by using 3 steps. The first one, understand the problem requirements and scope. Second, create a high level design, and then you can drill down later. And then 3, identify bottlenecks that could potentially be in your system and scale up appropriately. we can go over a quick example. So say a system design question asks you to design an app where users can ask and answer questions anonymously. Think of like a primitive Yahoo Ask or Yahoo Answers. Second. So the first thing we want to do again is understand and identify the requirements of our system. Users should be able to view questions, add new questions, add answers to existing questions, search through existing questions, and then see a feed of recently asked questions. Our service should also be highly available. That means if one question is really popular, when I go to view it, the page shouldn't crash or anything like that. There could be even more hidden requirements. It's really up to you and the interviewer to kind of drill down what the core bits of functionality are. So now that you've identified the requirements and you know what you need to build, you can create a high level design. You can think about the APIs that you might need, think about the data you need to store, and then how you want to store it. Maybe we have two tables, a table for questions and a table for answers. And then once you have that idea of what core things you need, you can expand it and scale up. Say our system turns out to be read heavy, we can create a read replica for our database. Maybe we don't want to hit the database each time. Maybe we can throw a cache in there. Maybe we find that we get a lot of traffic from clients. Maybe we can scale up and add another server and add a load balancer so that requests are divided appropriately between our servers. So I know that was a lot, but yeah. Okay, so I'm looking at the comments. So yeah, yes. So give the interviewer options. Ask them what you want, or ask them what they want you to talk about, so that you can make sure that you're actually answering their questions correctly. All right. So what interviewers are looking for, we want to know how you understand and analyze problems. Do you break down the problem into smaller, more manageable components? But we also want to see if you have an understanding of common and popular design patterns. Again, if you don't have experience designing these things yourselves, have you done research? Have you looked and thought about it deeply? We also want you to be able to describe alternative approaches and explain the pros and cons of each. So if you are deciding to use one database schema versus another, you need to explain the why and what you get from that decision. We also want to know if you know about different types of databases and their trade-offs. Why is a NoSQL database better here versus a SQL database? If you're using NoSQL, if you want to say you're using Mongo, why Mongo and not DynamoDB? We also want to know, is your design scalable? Can you adjust your design so that it can scale? And then lastly, can you explain your ideas and communicate them to others? I would say that out of any interview, half the battle is communication. Of course, half is the technical part, but if you can't communicate effectively, that'll really hurt you. So you really want to get practice and experience with your communication and how you convey ideas. If there's anything else about system design questions, feel free to add it to the chat. Otherwise, we can switch gears a little bit now and talk more about finding your fit. So you can think back to what Nick was talking about in terms of figuring out what your values are and what's most important to you. So think about a company's values and how it may align with your own. Think about the engineering culture of a particular company. Is it collaborative? Is it competitive? How do engineers work? Do they use sprints or cycles or some other project management strategy? Also think about growth. How do you want to grow in your career? And are those growth opportunities available at that company? If you're trying to move up the engineering ladder, if you're trying to move into technical leadership or management, you want to see if that path exists in your next role. Also consider the tech stack. Are there any technologies that you hate and want to stay away from? Are there any technologies you're really excited about and want to use? You want to find out what tech you'll be working with day to day because it could have an impact on your enjoyment of the work. Also consider diversity. Think about what Z was talking about being the only one. Do you want to be the only one? Is that something you're okay with? Also consider if a company has any employee resource groups that you could be a part of, or maybe that you could start. Also think about work-life balance. I think this is extremely important and it has kind of become a big deal over the past year as we've gone through a lot of individual stress and Burnout, make sure that you have a good work-life balance. Also consider office life. If you're the type of person who wants to be in an office, see if that option is available to you. I know when I was interviewing back in 2020, we couldn't actually go into the office just yet. So I had recruiters actually send me photos of what the office looked like or snippets of people describing what their favorite things in the office were. Also consider remote work. If you're the type of person who wants to work remote, then you want to see if a company offers any kind of incentive or monetary benefit to help create the best workspace when you're working from home. Also, think about compensation, not just salary, but also stock options, 401k matching, signing bonuses, any form of monetary compensation, and make sure that the company that is giving you an offer is paying you fairly and paying you what you're worth. Also consider perks. There's still companies who offer perks. It could be gym benefits or gym reimbursements. It could be parking benefits. It could be travel reimbursements. If there are any perks or like nice to haves that you want, you should try to get them. So then once you have kind of narrowed down the things that you really, really want, you can make a note of it. I had a notebook that I used when I was interviewing last that had every bit of information that I wanted, and I asked about all that information whenever I did an interview. Know that during the on-site or the virtual on-site is when you get the most face time with employees to talk about the company and ask questions. I know that at the end of every interview, sometimes there's 5 to 10 minutes where the interviewer will turn around and ask you, like, oh, do you have any questions? And you might say, oh, no, I don't have any questions, but you probably should. You probably do have questions. And if you have like an opportunity to ask an employee what their experience is, you should definitely take that opportunity. Also, remember to reach out after the interview if you have more questions. I remember I was interviewing at one company and I was like still like on the fence about making my decision. So I asked, "Hey, can I just have another 30 minutes with the eng manager?" And I was able to get that 30 minutes and just sort of pick his brain and ask him like all the stuff I feel like I still had lingering in my mind, and that was really helpful. Also, engineering and company blogs have a ton of information. All the cool projects that a company is working on, any new features they've released are usually on their blog, and you can read through there and see like what's happening and what's popping. There are also resources outside of the company where you can get information. I know Glassdoor, if people are familiar with it, is a website where people can rate and review companies. There's also Blind, which is an anonymous forum where people can talk about companies and discuss issues. Levels.fyi is a good one. It allows you to compare salaries and engineering levels across different companies. LinkedIn also has a salary page, which lets you search salary information by region and company. This is really helpful when you're at that offer negotiation stage and you want to get an idea of how much you should be getting paid and if the company is being fair in your compensation. You can also look on LinkedIn and find people who work at a particular company, and don't be afraid to just message them and say, hey, can I have like 10 minutes of your time to ask you about your experience? Usually people are pretty amenable to that. So definitely consider that as well. Backing up a little bit, um, in terms of resources for technical interviews, LeetCode is usually the premier website for practicing coding questions. There's also Pramp.com, which I really loved when I was interviewing. It matches you with a peer, and then you take turns interviewing each other. It also has a system design component. So if you haven't done a system design interview before, definitely check that out. And it's a really good way to get practice with system design interviews because I feel like there are fewer resources and opportunities for practicing those. Also, HackerRank, not only is it used for conducting interviews, they also have coding questions and tutorials on their website as well. Also, the System Design Primer is an open source project on GitHub. It has a lot of information to teach you how to design systems and also a number of practice questions that you can maybe work through. And Kathy had a good point in the chat that if you don't see a woman on your interview panel and it's important to you, you can also talk to a female engineer. That is key. I have had experiences where I've been the only female on someone's panel, and sometimes they get really excited to see me. And I'm like, yes, I will tell you everything you want to know. And they'll usually be transparent. And that's really it. I think we're making good time. Let me double check. Um, Looks like we just made it, but don't worry because at 2, I have a small group session, so we can talk more there.